After balancing 2 jobs for a year, while my husband stayed at home, I got pregnant, and in my 7th month of pregnancy I went on maternity leave, but husband packed my bags and kicked me out, saying he wouldn't tolerate lazy slackers in the house. I took this document that husband had been hiding from in-laws, and now he's bombarding me with apologies. But it's too late, as he can kiss goodbye to his inheritance dreams. I had told him over and over again to get a job. It wasn't like I was asking for much, but every time I brought it up, he'd brush it off like it was no big deal. He would say he was figuring things out or that he wasn't ready yet, but I had heard those excuses for months. It felt like I was begging for a solution that wasn't coming. Meanwhile, I was juggling 2 jobs to keep us afloat. Every night, I came home exhausted to find him sprawled on the couch playing video games or scrolling through his phone, doing anything but contributing. It wasn't even like he had no experience. Before all this, he worked with his brother at their family's company. They were a well-known name and had money. I thought we were stable, but then out of nowhere his brother who ran the company kicked him out. The way he told it, there were some differences, but when I pressed him, he wouldn't give me more than that. He would just clam up and look away, avoiding the topic like it was something I was supposed to dig into. It felt like there was more to it than he was letting on, but he never came clean, and that's when everything started to feel like it was spiraling. So I took on both jobs. I had to. We needed the money, and I couldn't keep waiting around for him to make a move. By the time I found out I was pregnant, I had already spent a full year working 2 jobs. The exhaustion was taking its toll. My husband didn't even seem to acknowledge the pressure I was under. He was still sitting at home waiting for his big break while I worked myself into the ground. I'll admit, I was hoping that when the pregnancy test came back positive, it might be the kick in the pants he needed. Maybe seeing a little life growing inside me would light a fire under him. But instead, it felt like I was the only one excited about the baby. He didn't seem to care that we'd need more stability, more security, and more of everything. Really. And that made me feel like I was carrying the entire weight of our future on my own. So when I hit my 7th month and finally went on maternity leave, I thought things might settle into a rhythm. I thought we could both take a break, get ready for the baby, and he might finally step up. But I was wrong. The moment I came home for my last day of work, bags packed and ready to take it easy for a while, I walked through the door to find my things already packed up. His words hit me like a punch to the gut. He said he wouldn't tolerate lazy slackers in the house, as if I was the one who had been avoiding responsibility. His face was hard and I could see the coldness in his eyes. The shock was so much that I couldn't even respond right away. I just stood there speechless, feeling like the world had tilted under my feet. I couldn't believe it. After everything I had done, everything I had sacrificed, this was how he treated me. He was kicking me out? I finally found my voice and I asked him, still struggling to process the situation, if he was really going to throw me out. He didn't answer right away, just looked at me like I was the problem. He went on to explain how he'd put up with me being lazy for far too long, that I was just sitting around now doing nothing but being pregnant. It was as if he couldn't see all the work I had put into our lives, all the sacrifices I had made just to keep us afloat. It felt like a slap in the face. I couldn't hold it in anymore. The anger that had been building for so long poured out of me. I told him he didn't get to call me lazy. I had been doing everything. 2 jobs, keeping this house running, everything. While he had just sat there waiting for something to happen, I had been the one working day in and day out. I told him he couldn't call me lazy when I had been the one holding everything together. I told him that if anyone was lazy, it was him sitting around doing nothing while I was out there working my off. I said he had let everything fall apart with his brother, and now he was blaming me. I wasn't the one sitting around hoping for a miracle. I was the one out there making it happen. I saw his face tighten when I said that. For a second, I thought he might yell back, but instead, he just turned away. His hands ran through his hair in frustration, and he muttered that I wasn't getting it. "Oh, I got it," I said. I got it loud and clear. I grabbed my things and my bags and made my way to the door. But just as I was about to leave, something caught my eye. There, tucked under a pile of papers on the counter, was an official-looking document. It wasn't the kind of thing I would have expected to find in our mess. It was neatly folded, a little worn at the edges, and I knew immediately it wasn't something I had ever seen before. I hesitated, but only for a moment. My gut told me I had to take it. I didn't know what it was, but something about it felt off. So I grabbed it, tucked it into my purse, and walked out the door. Outside, the cool air hit my face as I walked towards my car. I didn't even know where I was going. Part of me wanted to scream, to confront him again, but another part of me knew that this wasn't the fight I needed. The fight I needed was the one that was about to come. I didn't look at the document right away. I knew that if I opened it, there was a chance I wouldn't be able to unsee whatever was inside. But when I reached the car and sat in the driver's seat, I couldn't help myself. I wanted to get it over with. I pulled it out and unfolded it. The words on the page hit me like a slap. I sat there for a moment, letting it sink in. So this was what it was all about. This document explained everything. The sudden coldness, the lies, the way he was so quick to push me out. He had been holding on to this secret, waiting for the right time to act. And now I knew exactly what was going on. I had no intention of going back to him, not after everything he had said and done. I wasn't about to play his game anymore. I put the car in drive. I had one more thing to do before I left for good. I was going to make sure he understood that his dreams weren't going to come true. As if I had anything to say about it. I knew exactly where I was headed next, and it was the last place he would ever expect. Update 1. This is not an update. This is part 2. Apologies. I got tired typing. A lot of you were asking what was in the document. I'll give you as much information as I can in this part. So after everything that had happened, I knew exactly where I had to go. I drove straight to my in-laws' house. I didn't know how I was going to face them or what I was going to say, but I knew I couldn't be alone right now. When I arrived, I didn't even have to knock. My mother-in-law was standing by the door, her eyes scanning me before she even opened it fully. Without a word, she stepped aside and let me in, ushering me into the warmth of their home. I don't think she even asked what had happened, but the concern on her face was clear. She saw the exhaustion in my eyes and the raw emotion I was trying to keep in check. I barely got in the door before she wrapped her arms around me, pulling me into a tight hug. It wasn't a "how are you" hug. It was an "I can see you're hurting" hug. And in that moment I was grateful for it. My father-in-law came in soon after, his usual gruffness replaced with a quiet understanding. He didn't ask for details either. Instead, he just led me to the couch and sat down beside me, waiting for me to speak when I was ready. Their house wasn't the kind of place where you felt like you had to explain yourself to earn a spot on the couch or in their lives. I had always felt welcome here. The house was simple, but it was full of warmth and history, and that was exactly what I needed right now. I had always had a solid relationship with my in-laws, especially compared to my rocky connection with my husband. From the beginning, they had treated me with respect, and I'd always appreciated their kindness. It wasn't like they had been completely blind to their son's shortcomings either. They knew what was going on between us, how he'd been lying to them and had gotten himself kicked out of his brother's company. They'd even made a few indirect comments about it to me, but they never pushed. They had always checked in on me, particularly during the pregnancy, even though they had a strained relationship with their son. They could see he wasn't living up to the expectations, and it weighed on them just as much as it did on me. But still, they didn't judge. They knew how to make me feel like I wasn't alone even when I was fighting my battles with him. I sat on their couch, my hands trembling as I looked at them, unsure of where to start. My emotions were all over the place. Part of me wanted to spill everything right then and there, but another part of me was too exhausted to even form the words. I looked at my mother-in-law, who gave me a gentle nod as if to say, "We're not going anywhere." My father-in-law had his elbows on his knees, his face a mixture of concern and confusion. He knew I wasn't someone to break down easily, so seeing me like this must have been a shock. It wasn't just the fight that had drained me, it was everything. The years of struggling, the loneliness of carrying the burden of our life on my shoulders while he did nothing, the fear that this would never end, and now here I was sitting in their living room with the weight of it all pressing down on me. Finally, after a long silence, I spoke. I told them everything. The fight, his words, how he had packed my things and kicked me out. They listened quietly, their faces somber. My mother-in-law's eyes narrowed when I mentioned how he called me lazy. She didn't say anything, but I could see the disgust on her face. My father-in-law, who usually kept his emotions in check, let out a sharp breath. He didn't have to say anything either. He just gave me a look that spoke volumes. I wasn't ready to show them the document, not yet. I was physically and emotionally drained. The exhaustion was so much that I couldn't even think straight. I didn't want to unload everything on them in one go. I needed to process it myself before I opened up about the bombshell I had discovered. But I knew I couldn't keep it from them forever. I had to tell them. I had to make them understand what he had been hiding. I let them know that I had something I needed to discuss with them, but not right then. I was too tired to go into details, but I promised that I'd explain everything the next day. My mother-in-law nodded, her face still full of concern, but also understanding. She knew me well enough to understand that I didn't want to dump everything on them all at once. My father-in-law was the one who spoke next. He said that he'd make us dinner and that we could talk when I was ready. I wasn't sure if he meant for it to be comforting or a way to distract me, but either way, it worked. I didn't want to sit there in the silence of my mind anymore. The smell of food in the air was a welcome distraction. My in-laws did what they always did. They kept the conversation light. They asked about the pregnancy, about the baby, about how I was feeling. It was as though they were trying to give me some normalcy in the middle of all this chaos. It didn't fix anything, but it was enough to take my mind off things for a while. Later, when the dishes were done and the conversation had moved to more mundane topics, I felt my body finally starting to relax. I was still angry. I was still hurt, but I felt a little less alone. A little less like I was falling apart. My in-laws didn't make me feel like I had to explain myself. They didn't make me feel guilty for leaning on them, and that was what I needed most right now. I didn't need to fix things or make everything better. I just needed to be taken care of for a little while. That night, as I lay on the bed in their guest room, I thought about the document I had found. I couldn't stop thinking about it. My mind kept racing back to that moment when I opened it in the car, seeing the words on the page that changed everything. It was a financial document related to my husband's family business, and it was clear from the way it was written that he had been planning to screw over his brother, possibly even to sell information to one of their rivals. It explained so much about his behavior, the way he had been acting like everything was fine while secretly setting up his future at my expense. I had no idea how long he'd been planning this or how deep it went, but I knew one thing for sure: I wasn't going to let him get away with it. I thought about waiting, but something inside me told me I had to show it to them immediately. I had to let them know what he had been hiding, especially since they had been worried about him for so long. I couldn't keep it from them anymore. The next morning after a quiet breakfast, I told them I had the document and that it was time to show them. They listened intently as I explained what I had found, their faces growing darker as I revealed more. My background is illegal, so I could join the dots. I saw the fury building behind their eyes. This wasn't just about me anymore. It was about their son and what he had been doing in the shadows. They were both silent for a long moment after I finished speaking. Finally, my father-in-law said that they were going to have to confront him about this. I could see that he was struggling with the decision. He didn't want to have to deal with his son, especially after everything that had happened, but he also knew that this couldn't be swept under the rug. Update 2. There was no more second guessing, no more wondering if I had made the right decision. The night before had been a blur, but today I was focused. I was still at my in-laws' place. The cold reality of the situation was setting in. I had to make sure I was doing what was best for me, not for him. Later in the afternoon, my phone buzzed. It was him. I hadn't heard from my husband since I left the house the day before. Part of me had hoped he'd leave me alone to process everything, but I knew better. Looks like he finally found out that the documents were missing. I took a deep breath before answering, fully prepared for whatever he was going to say. His voice sounded shaky when he spoke. He was trying to sound apologetic, but I could hear the desperation underneath. It was as if he had been practicing what he was going to say, but it still didn't feel right. He said he was sorry and that he knew things had gotten out of hand, that he should have handled things better. He wanted to talk, to fix everything, as if we could just rewind to before the last few months of absolute chaos. I let the silence hang in the air for a moment, letting him stew in the tension. I wasn't about to let him manipulate me into believing that his sudden guilt was anything more than a last-ditch effort to save face. I wasn't buying it. I told him I wasn't interested in talking and that he would soon be getting divorce papers. I made it clear this was it, that there was no turning back. I could almost hear the air leave his lungs. He was stunned, but he quickly tried to regain his composure. He insisted that he knew he'd screwed up, but he wasn't trying to play the victim. He said everything had just built up and that he was frustrated and under a lot of pressure. I didn't care about any of that. I had carried us for so long. I was done. I snapped back at him, reminding him that I'd been the one working 2 jobs for more than a year, even while I was pregnant, while he sat at home doing nothing. He had done nothing but wallow in his failure, and now when things were finally coming to a head, he was trying to act like I was the one who was at fault. He tried to downplay everything as if his laziness and selfishness were justifiable. He tried to make it sound like a minor misunderstanding that could be swept under the rug. He asked me to give him a chance and said that he'd change, that he would do whatever it took to make things right. I wasn't hearing any of it. His words felt hollow. There was no sincerity, no real acknowledgement of how much he had hurt me. He wasn't trying to fix things for me. He was trying to fix his own reputation, to save face with his family, to make sure they didn't think he was the failure. They'd already labeled him. I wasn't a fool. I didn't need any more lies from him. I told him I wasn't interested in his apologies. He could keep them because I didn't need them. I told him he was going to lose a lot more than just me and my child if he kept this up. Yes, my child. He doesn't deserve to be a father. He fumbled for something to say. His voice cracked, and I could hear the desperation in his tone. He asked if I had found anything in my luggage, any papers. He was fishing, trying to find out if I'd uncovered what he'd been hiding. I wasn't going to let him know that I knew exactly what he was worried about, but I could feel his fear creeping in. His voice faltered as he tried to downplay it, saying there was nothing in the documents. He kept repeating that there was nothing to worry about, but the panic in his voice told me everything I needed to know. I wasn't about to fall for it. I kept my response sharp, asking him what papers he was talking about. I didn't care what was in them. All I cared about was getting away from him and finally taking control of my life. I wasn't going to let him drag me back into his world of manipulation. He was trying to avoid answering, but I saw through it. I knew exactly what was going on. He was trying to protect himself from whatever I'd uncovered, and I wasn't about to give him the satisfaction of knowing what I had found. I kept my response call asking him what he thought I had found, refusing to give him the upper hand. He didn't know how to respond. His attempts to explain himself only made things worse. He tried to backpedal, tried to explain how frustrated he'd been, how everything had gone wrong, but none of it mattered anymore. I had heard every excuse, every manipulation he had to offer, and none of it was going to change my mind. I was done. I wasn't going to be guilted or manipulated into staying in a marriage that had drained me emotionally, physically, and mentally. The truth was he had never really cared about me. He had always cared about himself and his comfort, and now he was paying the price. I told him again more firmly this time that I was done, that I would be sending the divorce papers. I wasn't going to keep going in circles with him. He could beg all he wanted, but nothing was going to change the fact that I had made up my mind. He tried one last time, but I wasn't listening. He could beg and apologize all he wanted, but I knew the truth now. He wasn't the man I thought he was. He wasn't even the man I had tried to love. He was just a scared little boy trying to save face, trying to protect his own skin, and I wasn't going to be the one to make it easy for him anymore. Finally, he stopped speaking. The line went silent, and I could almost hear him sitting there waiting for me to soften, waiting for me to give in, but I wasn't going to. It was over, and there was no going back. Before I hung up, I told him one last thing. If you really cared about us, you would have done something before it got to this point, but you didn't, and now you'll have to deal with the consequences. I didn't wait for him to respond. I ended the call and put the phone down. My heart was pounding in my chest, but there was a strange sense of calm. I had done it. I wasn't going to let him destroy me anymore. Now it was time to rebuild, and I was lucky enough to have at least 2 supportive people around me in this state. Update 3. A lot of you asked if the house was under my soon-to-be ex's name. No, it wasn't. It was under my in-law's name. It was in a way a wedding gift. A week had passed. That time felt like a blur, just a series of hurried conversations, frantic steps towards securing my future, and the slow but steady realization that the man I had spent so much time and energy building a life with was a complete a-hole. But amid the chaos, my in-laws had stood by me in ways I hadn't expected. He had been kicked out of that house, by the way. We didn't have any contract with them or any rental agreement. I was still staying at their house. My father-in-law, quiet and reserved, had taken the lead in dealing with his son. And despite the situation, they had taken me in without hesitation. That afternoon, my father-in-law called. He wanted to meet with me. I had no idea what to expect, but I knew it was important. When I arrived, my father-in-law greeted me in his usual calm, stoic manner, and my mother-in-law was already seated beside him, her presence warm and comforting. I sat down wondering what they wanted to discuss. I had enough on my plate without adding more surprises, but I knew better than to expect anything simple. After a long silence, my father-in-law spoke. His voice steady as always. He told me that they had decided to take action regarding my husband's behavior. They wouldn't be confronting him as a family. Instead, they had decided to pursue legal action. He said that they thought it was the best course of action given how things had gone, and the relief that washed over me was immediate. Legal action against his son? My mind raced trying to process what he was saying. My husband's betrayal was one thing, but to have his parents take such a bold stance was something I hadn't expected. I thought it might be hard for them to go against their own son, but clearly they were willing to do what was necessary. He continued, noticing my silence, saying that I didn't have to worry about any of it, that it had nothing to do with me. My mother-in-law said that I wasn't responsible for his actions and that they didn't want me feeling like I had to carry this weight. I breathed out slowly, the tension that had been building up in my shoulders easing. Their words helped in a way, but there was still that nagging part of me that had carried the burden of everything he had done. And now to hear them take charge in such a firm, unflinching way made me feel like I wasn't alone anymore. Before I could say anything, my mother-in-law added her thoughts. She said that her parents wanted to meet me. I was confused for a moment. I didn't even know them well. But apparently, they had heard about everything and wanted to offer their support. I had heard about them from my ex-husband, but they were distant still. If they were coming to offer support, I figured I could at least meet them. The idea of more people entering my life in the midst of all of this was overwhelming, but my mother-in-law's tone was reassuring. My father-in-law, noticing my hesitation, told me not to worry about it and that they were not here to judge me. They just wanted to make sure I was okay. It was strange but comforting. I had never expected this kind of reception from my in-laws. They could have distanced themselves or worse, sided with their son, but they hadn't. Instead, they were offering me a sense of security at a time when everything else felt unstable. My mother-in-law continued by saying that I could stay for the rest of my pregnancy, and even after that, until you feel ready to move out and go back to work. We'll make sure you and the baby have everything you need. You don't need to worry about anything, she added. Her words were like a balm to the raw aching parts of me that had been bruised by my husband's abandonment. I had been so focused on surviving, on keeping my head above water, that I hadn't stopped to consider what it would feel like to be cared for in a way that didn't come with strings attached. My in-laws had given me that gift, and for now I would be eternally grateful. I looked at both of them with gratitude. I felt a warmth that had nothing to do with obligation. They were offering me comfort, a roof over my head, an unconditional support. I didn't have anyone else. That meant a lot. I thanked them for everything. I didn't even have time to process the depth of what they were offering before my mind shifted to the reality of my situation. I had no family on my side, no parents, no siblings. My mother had died when I was younger and my father was long gone. I had grown up with no support, learning how to rely on myself from a very early age. When I got married, I thought I had found someone to share my life with, someone who would help me carry the burden, but I had been wrong. Now, I was facing another challenge, but this time I wasn't alone. My father-in-law gave me a nod as if understanding the weight of my silence. "We're just happy you're here with us. You deserve peace, especially now." I nodded in return, grateful for their kindness. I couldn't say much more without breaking down completely, so I just let the moment sit. The thought of my in-laws stepping in to help me in ways I never imagined made me feel like for the first time in a long time, I wasn't completely on my own. I had no parents to call, no extended family to lean on, but at least now I had them in the most difficult part of my life. I began to feel hope. It wasn't the kind of hope that came from pretending everything would be okay. No. This hope came from the quiet, steady realization that I wasn't facing this alone, and that for me made all the difference in the world. I felt like I could handle it, and that was more than I could say before. Last update, 4. It's been about a month since I was kicked out, and I still haven't given birth 2 weeks ago. Things have been a little hectic with the baby on the way, but honestly, it feels good to just be away from all the mess. I met my grand-in-laws last week, and they were amazing. They've been nothing but supportive, and I was kind of shocked when they told me they were removing my husband from their will. They said the inheritance would go to my child instead. I couldn't help but feel a little satisfied hearing that. It's all gone now. I didn't ask for any of this, but I'm not going to complain.